the thin, high-altitude air of the Colorado Rockies making the work a misery. The year was 1874, and he was indoors. He wasn't chopping firewood. He was trying to shove a desperate diagonal brace against the main purlin of his own roof. The wind didn't howl. It was a solid, pressing scream against the north wall, a sound so constant it had become a new kind of silence. But it was the other sound that had sweat freezing on his forehead. It was a low, granular grinding. It was the sound of the ridgepole, a 12-inch lodgepole pine, slowly being crushed by the weight of the snow above it. It sounded like a giant was grinding stones inside the timber. His cabin, built in the optimistic rush of early summer, was failing. He could feel the cold, not just as an absence of heat, but as a presence, a physical weight that pressed through the gaps in the chinking. A fine, glittering powder of snow was being driven through the cracks, dusting the floor and his beard. He was a trapper in his late 30s, and he knew hardship. He knew the bite of a trap, the danger of a sudden whiteout, the hunger of a long stalk. But this was a new, suffocating terror. This was the terror of geometry and gravity. The structure he had built for shelter was becoming his tomb. The lantern light flickered, casting warped shadows that seemed to pulse with the groaning of the wood. The roof, which had seemed so solid in August, was visibly sagging in the middle, maybe a full 6 inches lower than it should be. He remembered the story from the previous winter over in the next valley. A freighter named Hobbs, found in the spring melt, pressed flat with his stove. His cabin's roof collapsed so perfectly it looked like a folded box. Silas's own stove glowed a dull red, eating seasoned pine at a rate that was impossible to sustain. Yet the corners of the cabin were rimmed with thick, opaque frost. Worse, a steady drip, drip, drip came from beside the chimney. The immense weight of the compacted snow, piled deep against the warm stovepipe, was melting, and the water wasn't running off. It was running in. It soaked his bedroll. It made the air damp and colder. This wasn't shelter. This was a siege, and he was losing. He jammed the brace log hard against the purlin. The grinding sound paused, as if the mountain was taking a breath, and then resumed, a low, agonizing creak that vibrated in his bones. He knew with a sudden, terrible clarity that this cabin, built exactly the way everyone else built theirs, would not last the winter. He had built it just like the others, just as the pamphlets back east had shown, just as the men at the settlement had advised. When Silas arrived in the high valley that May, the ground was a carpet of columbine and the air was warm and smelled of pine resin. The rush was on. Miners, speculators, and other trappers were throwing up structures with a speed that bordered on panic. The goal was to get a roof up before the summer rains, and to be ready for the trapping season by first snow. "Speed is strength," a man named McCready had told him, spitting tobacco. "Get it standing." So Silas had. He'd felled the green, sappy lodgepole pines. They were easy to cut and easy to work. He'd used a simple saddle notch at the corners, just as his father had done in the rolling hills of Tennessee. It was fast. You just axed out a shallow curve and stacked the next log in. The walls went up in 2 weeks, but the roof was the problem, though no one saw it then. The standard method called for a low-pitch roof, maybe a 4 in 12, meaning for every 12 inches of horizontal run, it only rose 4 inches. It was easy to build. It required shorter rafters, less cutting, and a man could sheet it himself without falling. It looked fine. It looked like a cabin. It shed the summer rain. But it was not designed for this place. It was not designed for a place where snow was measured in feet, not inches. The first winter had been a brutal education. The low pitch didn't shed the snow, it held it. The snow piled up, and the gentle sun of the high altitudes would melt the top layer, which would then freeze into a solid slab of ice, locking the powder beneath. The green logs of the cabin walls began to cure in the dry, thin air. They twisted, shrank, and warped. The saddle notches, so quick to cut, opened up. The chinking, a hasty mix of mud and dried grass, cracked and fell out. The wind didn't just knock. It moved in. Silas had spent that first winter in a state of constant, exhausting battle. He'd have to climb onto the roof in the middle of blizzards, tethered by a rope, and frantically shovel, throwing tons of snow off just to prevent a collapse. The sheer risk of it was madness. Inside, it was a thermodynamic nightmare. The stove would blast heat, which would rise and leak directly through the poorly planked roof. The floor, built on mudsills laid right on the ground, was a perimeter of ice. He burned through 3 times the firewood he had cut. He realized he was spending more energy trying to survive his shelter than he was trapping. He'd wake up with his beard frozen solid to his wool blanket. This was the standard way, and it was killing him. The groaning of his ridgepole in the second winter was just the final verdict. The standard way was wrong. That spring, after a winter spent in a constant state of dread, Silas Vane hiked out. He'd survived only because the worst of the storms had held off, but he knew he'd just been lucky. He went to the lower settlement, not to trade, but to listen. He heard the news. 2 cabins in the Gentry Valley had collapsed. A man named Peterson and his young partner. Gone. Crushed flat. While the other trappers drank and griped about the bad winter, Silas sought out the one man who had seemed unsurprised. His name was Henrik Gunnarsson. Henrik was an old Swede, a carpenter who had come west not for gold, but to build the massive timber-frame ore-stamping mills for the mining companies. These were structures designed to withstand immense vibration and crushing loads. Silas found him outside the assay office, smoking a pipe and carving a small, intricate piece of pine. His hands were like gnarled oak, yet his movements were precise. Silas, feeling foolish, described his cabin. He described the sagging roof, the grinding ridgepole, the infiltrating snow. Henrik listened, his pale blue eyes fixed on the middle distance. He didn't laugh. When Silas was finished, the old man slowly nodded. He took his pipe from his mouth. "You built a shelf," Henrik said, his voice a low rumble. "The mountain needs a place to put its snow. You built a shelf for it." He took 2 small twigs and placed them on the ground in a low A shape, like a low-pitch roof. "This is your roof. The snow pushes down." He pressed his finger on the peak. The 2 twigs immediately splayed out flat. "It pushes out. It wants to break your walls. It is a weak shape. It invites the load and then breaks under it." Silas stared at the splayed twigs. That was exactly what his walls felt like they were doing. Then Henrik picked up the twigs and arranged them again, this time in a very steep A shape, almost an arrow point. "This," he said, "is a roof." He pressed down, hard. The twigs drove their ends into the dirt, supporting his finger. The snow pushes down. The roof says down. It sends the push into the earth. It is a strong shape. But he wasn't done. He took a 3rd, shorter twig and braced it between the 2 steep legs high up. "This is the collar. This is the truss. This triangle. This is God's own shape. It cannot be moved. The weight on top only locks it tighter. You did not build with triangles, boy. You built with hinges." Silas also began to observe. He watched the way the wind sculpted the snow into drifts, noting which side of the ridges were scoured clean and which held massive overhanging cornices. He saw how the native spruce and fir trees handled the snow. Their branches were sharply angled, drooping to shed the load. He realized Henrik was right. He hadn't built a roof, he'd built a trap. He decided then he would not just repair his cabin, he would tear it down and start again. Silas Vane did not trap that summer. He worked. He took a job hauling timber for Henrik at the new mill site. He earned wages, but the real payment was knowledge. He watched the old Swede and his crew. He learned to use his father's broadaxe not for crude hacking, but for shaping. He learned to shave a log flat and true, creating a cant. He learned to cut a deep, precise mortise, a square hole, and a matching tenon, a wooden tongue. He learned the art of the dovetail notch, a shape that locked the corners of a building together, getting tighter as the log settled. He learned that seasoned, standing dead timber, though harder to cut, was stable. Green wood was for fools in a hurry. But at night, in his sagging, damp cabin, he planned. He didn't have blueprints. He had a piece of charcoal and the smooth, pale surface of a crate lid. He was no longer just a trapper. He was becoming an engineer. He listed the failures, one by one, and sketched a solution for each. Failure 1. The foundation. His old cabin was on mud sills. The frost heave of the ground twisted the entire structure. Solution: stone. He would spend a month digging and hauling, and he would set his new cabin on 9 massive flat stones, creating a crawl space. The floor would be raised, away from the frozen, damp earth. Failure 2. The walls. His round, saddle-notched logs shifted and opened gaps. Solution: hewn timbers. He would hew every log flat on 2 sides. They would stack like bricks, flat on flat. This meant more surface area for chinking and a more stable wall, and the corners would be dovetails. Failure 3. The roof. This was his obsession. He sketched it again and again, not a 4 in 12, a 12 in 12, a perfect 45-degree angle. For every foot it went across, it went a foot up. It would be a sharp, dramatic A, a shape that would scream shed. And it would not just rest on the walls. He would build 5 trusses on the ground, just as Henrik was doing for the mill. He whittled a small model of one, just as Henrik had shown him. A heavy tie beam on the bottom to connect the walls. 2 steep top cords, the rafters, and a central king post, connecting the peak to the tie beam. All joined with mortise and tenon, and locked with hardwood pegs. It was 10 times the work. It was a staggering amount of cutting and chiseling. His neighbor McReady, rebuilding his own failed cabin with the same old, fast methods, saw Silas's foundation stones and laughed. "Building a castle, Vane? You'll be sleeping in a snowdrift come first frost." Silas just nodded and continued to sharpen his broadaxe. The axe was no longer just a tool for felling. It was a tool of precision. He stockpiled dry, standing dead aspen and spruce. He dug stones until his hands bled. He was racing the calendar, driven by the memory of that grinding sound. He began the new build in late June. The 9 foundation stones were the anchor. He spent a week just leveling them, shimming them with slate, knowing that a true foundation meant a true house. Then came the sills, the first massive hewn logs, perfectly dovetailed at the corners. The thunk shave. of his broadaxe echoed in the valley. It was a slower, more methodical sound than the frantic chopping of the previous year. He was not rushing, he was building. The walls rose, log by flat-hewn log. The dovetail joints were a slow, agonizing puzzle. He had to scribe the exact angle onto each log, saw the rough cuts, and finish with a chisel and mallet. A quarter-inch off, and the joint would be loose. It took him a full day to cut a single corner. His old cabin's walls had taken 2 weeks. These walls took 2 months. They were beautiful, solid, and almost seamless. Then the roof. This was the hidden method, the part no one understood. He built the 5 trusses on the flat, packed earth. The tie beams were 10 inches thick. The king posts were like small trees. He cut the mortises, chiseled the tenons, fit them, and drilled the peg holes, not with a drill, but by heating a long iron rod in his fire and burning the holes clean through. He whittled hardwood pegs from a dry piece of oak he'd hoarded. He assembled the first truss. It was a massive, perfect triangle, heavy and unyielding. Raising them was the test. He couldn't do it alone. He traded a full month's worth of cured meat and a week of his labor to Macready and another man, Jensen. The 3 of them, using ropes, levers, and sheer grunting force, raised the first truss into place, locking it onto the top plate of the walls. It was a moment of triumph. It stood silhouetted against the sky. Then the second, the third, the fourth, the 5th. When all 5 stood, connected by heavy purlins, they looked like the skeleton of a great cathedral. It was immensely strong. It was overbuilt. Macready just shook his head, muttering about wasted wood. Silas roofed it not with flimsy shakes, but with thick, hand-split pine boards, overlapped by a full foot. He chinked the walls with a mixture of clay, sand, wood ash, and dried moss, a recipe from Henrik that would cure like mortar but remain flexible. He finished the last board on the roof ridge, just as the first probing flakes of October snow began to drift down. The winter of 1875 was not a winter. It was a judgment. It began in November and did not stop. By January, the snow in the valley was 10 feet deep on the level, and the drifts against the north side of his cabin were piled clear over the roofline. It was a weight that Silas could not have comprehended the year before. It was the winter that would be spoken of in hushed tones for 50 years. The pine cracker winter. Inside his new cabin, Silas waited. The first test was the sound. In his old cabin, the soundtrack of a storm was groaning, cracking, and the scream of the wind. In this one, there was a deep, profound silence. The hewn, chinked walls were so tight that the wind, even at its most furious, could only produce a low hum. It found no purchase. The second test was the warmth. His new, smaller stove, set on a stone hearth, kept the single room at a comfortable temperature. The heat rose, hit the high, peaked ceiling, and circulated back down. The floor, raised on its stone piers, was cool, but not a sheet of ice. He was burning half the wood as before, but the true test was the roof. The snow came and came. It was heavy, wet, cascade cement snow. It built up. Silas would listen. He would hear a low, muffled rumble, and then a tremendous, earth-shaking whoomp. The first time it happened, he grabbed his rifle, thinking the mountain was collapsing. It was his roof. The 12-in-12 pitch was doing its job. The snow would build to a critical point, and then the entire mass would avalanche off the steep. Smooth boards, piling in massive, harmless drifts 10 feet from his walls. But then came the true trial, a 3-day blizzard that buried the valley completely. The snow didn't slide, it just piled. It was too deep, too fast. This was the crushing load he had feared. He looked up. His trusses were not hidden by a ceiling. They were exposed. He could see them. He watched the massive timbers. They did not sag. They did not groan. The king posts were rigid. The tie beams were taut. The triangles were holding. The weight of the storm, tons and tons of it, was being captured, channeled, and driven down the hewn walls into the stone piers, and from there into the frozen earth. It wasn't magic. It was a triangle. Then, in the dead of night, he heard it. A sound that jolted him from his chair, a deep, echoing crack like artillery fire. It wasn't his cabin, it was distant. A few minutes later, another. Crack thump. He knew with cold certainty what he was hearing. It was the sound of ridgepoles snapping. It was the sound of shelves collapsing. The storm raged for 2 more days. Silas remained in his bubble of warmth and silence, the smell of wood smoke and coffee filling the air. He was not surviving. He was living. When the storm finally broke and he tunneled his way out into the blinding new white world, the valley was unrecognizable, and across the way where Macready's cabin had been, there was only a low, sad mound of snow, a broken ridgepole, and a stovepipe sticking out at a drunken angle. The survivors were few. Macready had made it, having clawed his way out a window as his roof came down. Jensen had been lucky. His roof had only partially caved in. They gathered at Silas's cabin, drawn by the impossible sight of its tall, clean roofline. They stepped inside, out of the blinding snow, and just stopped. They stared. They looked up at the 5 massive trusses, the hewn walls, the clean, dry floor. They felt the warmth. It was a refuge. Macready, a man not given to apologies or compliments, ran his hand over one of the dovetailed corners. He looked at Silas, his face gaunt. "Vain," he said, his voice hoarse. "How?" Silas didn't gloat. He felt only a deep, profound sadness for the men who hadn't listened. He took out the small, carved model of the king post truss he had made that summer. He set it on the table. He showed them the sticks just as Henrik had shown him. He explained the push. He showed them how the triangle contained the force. He talked about seasoned wood. He talked about building for the mountain, not for the summer. That summer, there was no rush to build shelves. There was a slow, methodical raising of vein roofs, as they began to be called, though Silas always corrected them. "It's a king post," he'd say. "It's Henrik's roof." The idea spread, carried by trappers and prospectors. It moved to the next valley, and the next. Some, in a hurry, didn't build the full complex trusses, but they all started building steep. A 10 in 12 pitch became the new standard. Cabins began to be set on stone. People stopped building with green wood. The very silhouette of a high-altitude cabin began to change. It went from a low, wide, vulnerable box to a tall, sharp, resilient A shape. Years later, new settlers would arrive and build that way simply because that's how it was done. They were copying a copy of a solution, unaware that the design was a direct, life-saving response to the brutal, clarifying judgment of the Pinecracker winter of 1875. The legacy wasn't in Silas's name. It was in the shape of the roof lines that survived, a silent geometry of shared wisdom. What Silas Vane had done, guided by Henrik Gunnarsson's old-world knowledge, was make the critical leap from vernacular building to intuitive structural engineering. The standard cabin that everyone else had built was a gravity structure. It stood up only because its parts were stacked on top of each other. It had no coherent answer for the dynamic loads of a high-altitude winter. The wind, the frost heave, and especially the snow were active forces, and the low-pitch roof was a catastrophic failure in managing them. It was, as Henrik had said, a hinge. The weight of the snow didn't just press down, it created an immense horizontal thrust at the top of the walls. It acted like a wedge, actively pushing the walls apart until the ridgepole, its support gone, snapped. The hidden method of the truss was the answer. A truss is not just a shape, it's a system. It is a machine for collecting and directing force. By connecting the two steep rafters with a heavy, unmoving tie beam at the bottom, Silas contained that horizontal thrust. The tie beam was put in tension, it was being pulled apart, and its strong peg joinery held it fast. The central king post was in compression. It took the load from the roof's peak and drove it straight down to the tie beam, which then distributed the entire weight of the roof and the snow as a simple, manageable vertical load. The force was driven straight down the hewn walls, into the stone foundation, and into the earth. It was precisely what a modern engineer would design. The steep 12-in-12 pitch was the other half of the genius. It didn't just shed snow. By being steeper, it translated more of the snow's weight into compression and less into flexion, or bending force, which is what breaks a beam. His dovetail-jointed, flat-hewn walls acted as a single, interlocked unit, not a stack of loose logs. He had, without the formal language of physics, built a structure that worked with the forces of nature, not in ignorance of them. Silas Vane lived in that cabin for 30 more years. He trapped, he guided, and he watched the valley fill with silver miners and then empty out again when the ore veins ran thin. He watched his own reflection in the small, deep-set window turn from a young man to an old one. The cabin outlived him. It was still standing 100 years later, a grey, silent monument used by hunters and hikers, a testament to the winter of 75. The broadaxe he had used, its handle replaced 3 times, eventually hung over the hearthstone he had set so carefully. The story of that roof became a parable in the high country. It was about more than snow loads. It was a lesson in humility. The men who built the shelves had imposed their ideas on the mountain. They built what was fast. They built what they knew from Ohio or Tennessee, from a world without a 6-month winter and 20-foot snows. They had built with arrogance. Silas, humbled by his first failure, had built with respect. He had listened to the wisdom of a man from another, older land. He had observed the logic of the mountain itself. He had chosen to do the hard thing, the slow thing, the right thing, long before the crisis arrived. While others were building for the summer, he was building for the one storm that would define a lifetime. His cabin was not an object, but a relationship, a durable agreement between human ingenuity and natural law. It stood not because it fought the snow, but because it understood it. It was a physical proof that preparation is not pessimism. It is the highest form of respect for reality. The triangle, the joinery, the foundation, these were not just building techniques. They were the physical form of a simple, timeless truth. What is built in haste, in ignorance of the forces that surround it, is already collapsing. The only things that endure are those built with honesty, an understanding of the load, and a willingness to see the world not as we wish it to be, but as it truly is.